the work originated from, I was in Brno in the Czech Republic at a film festival, and I'd made a film about factories and industrial areas in Europe kind of coming to a demise and ceasing production. And I was told about these 3 factories that were in the region: a tractor factory, an arms factory, and a Semtex factory. And I kind of realized that all 3 of these things, tractors, guns, and Semtex explosive in particular, had a very direct relationship with a part of Ireland where my mother's from and where a lot of my relatives are from. Tractors because the area is South Armagh, which is just north of the border in Northern Ireland. And the tractors were used because it's a very agricultural area, but it's a poor part of the country, and Ireland was a poor country in the 50s. And so these Czech tractors that were mass-produced, they were cheap, lightweight tractors, were able to be used in countries like Ireland where people didn't have a lot of money. So that radically altered the agricultural landscape. And then in the late 60s, as the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland descended into the Troubles, there was a lot of violence in the area, and particularly this area of South Armagh, which was the most kind of violent area in Northern Ireland from the early 70s through to the mid-1990s. And there was the most British Army casualties in that area. So in the early 70s, a senior member of the IRA went to Brno to try and procure some weapons for use in Northern Ireland that ended up being captured in Amsterdam Schiphol Airport. And then finally, in the same region, they produced Semtex plastic explosive, which was a Prague-based company called Omnipol they oversee arms trading internationally. And in the late 70s, they sold quite a serious amount of Semtex to in the late 70s, they sold a serious amount of a large amount of Semtex to Muammar al-Gaddafi, and he in turn donated some of that Semtex to the South Armagh, well, to the IRA, and at that point the South Armagh Brigade of the IRA were overseeing the military campaign. So all the bombs that were made that were subsequently used in England, like the Canary Wharf bomb, the Manchester Arndale Centre bomb, and the Bishopsgate bomb, were all produced in South Armagh in cowsheds and exported to England. So I was very interested in this trade between these regions that hadn't previously been known. I didn't know anything about it, and no one in the Czech Republic I spoke to knew anything about it, and no one in Ireland I knew anything about it. And it was because of the political landscape in Europe at the time that in Warsaw Pact countries had a different relationship with this idea of colonialism and post-colonialism than NATO countries did. And so therefore there was this trade that could happen between Libya, between Ireland, that wouldn't have been possible in NATO countries. So I was very interested in how certain activity, such as arms trading or industrial manufacturing in one particular region, can have a very great impact in another region, and the two are not connected. And I think there's a relationship between that and also then this idea of what borders are and who gets to delineate borders. So there's a border across Europe in the latter part of the 20th century that is an ideological border. Whereas in Ireland you have this political border that's drawn, you know, in the early 20th century, that's still there today, even though it's not manned militarily. And I think that that's something that's still very prevalent. Like we're in 2015, the early 21st century. People talk about how the age of imperialism and colonialism is over, that these dialogues are not important dialogues, and that any kind of political unrest we have in the world is due to extremist Muslims, or, you know, there's all sorts of blame and responsibility placed. But I think if you look across the globe, a lot of the regions where we have really pronounced violent unrest, like if you think of the border of Syria right now, these are geographical borders that were drawn by the British establishment. And it's along these fault lines that violence erupts. And so for me, I think this is a very important issue and a very important question. And whilst no one really wants to be dragged into a historical dialogue, I think it's unavoidable. I mean, politics and history is a nefarious whirlpool, and the closer you get to it, you just get sucked down. And I think it's important to be aware of that and to have these dialogues. But for me, the people who are usually affected are the people who just happen to live there. So, you know, in Northern Ireland you have a large farming community, and essentially they're people who just want to farm and be with their families and live ordinary lives. But because of, well, it's a complex story, but for a number of reasons they weren't able to do so. Their environment became politicized, and so therefore the act of living there became a political act. And I think it's the same in Syria now, it's the same in Lebanon, it's the same in Palestine, it's the same everywhere, that because someone else draws the borders around where you live, and someone else determines the political nature of the activity that goes on in this place, you aren't given a choice. You live in a politicized area, and so no matter how indifferent you are to global politics or local politics, they dramatically affect your life and ultimately construct what your life is. So I think that these kind of wider, more searching conversations are the ones that really need to be had, and they're the ones that are never had. And I think that's why this exhibition is, for me personally, a very thematically interesting exhibition, and because it talks about violence and the fact that violence is an everyday aspect of all our lives, and certainly Western Europe is built and maintained on extreme violence, but this conversation is never had. You know, and if you watch television in Germany, in England, in Ireland, in France, on any given night of the week, there'll be a political roundtable discussion, and the established political figures will be identifying that they're opposed to violence, that violence is wrong and violence is bad. And this is the general consensus across Western Europe, and it's the civilized consensus. Violence is bad. Our societies are violent. They're constructed by violence. They're maintained by violence. We are intrinsically violent, and until we have an intelligent and far-reaching open conversation about that, we're always going to have violence along borders. We're always going to have violence in the Balkans. We'll have violence in Lebanon. We'll have violence in Palestine. It's not going to go away until we properly address the issue, which I don't think anyone in Western Europe wants to do, because it's not in their interest to do.